We're starting 25 seconds later. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it should be good.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for another In the Word. Three of us have been talking about the story of Noah and the flood, and we're coming to kind of the last chapter, chapter 9, and the tail section of 8 and 9, as we close up the story. And it's been quite a ride in just a few chapters, and so much has happened already in the story, and now things are coming to a close, and it kind of works as a prologue. I think we were kind of saying to the story of the Bible, the story of humanity and God's relationship with humanity, if you will. Um, yeah, you could kind of say in some ways that now this is really the beginning story of like the nations in the world and God working in the world in some way after this hard reset. And so we're going to look at some things in this chapter. It's a bit of a chunk of passage, but we're going to take it in full because there's so much happening in it. And so if you just read along with us or are listening, we encourage you to have your Bibles open or look up the passage. So it'll be 8, starting at verse 20, and we'll read all of chapter 9. And so, yeah, keep your eyes out for some of the crazy things that are happening here. And I'll read it today. So 8:20. So they've gotten out of the ark, right? They've all come back out, dry land, and we pick up here. So then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I've done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. And you be fruitful, multiply, increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I'll establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds and the livestock and every living beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I shall establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I'll remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it, and I'll remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is a sign of the covenant that I've established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Now the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil. He planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it both on their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, so they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah woke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So a lot happens here, and I think we're looking over a decent amount of time. We read it all in like 3 minutes, right? But I think there are stages that are kind of clumped up together. But this is kind of like all the contents of what happened post flood, right, with Noah and his family. But there is something very curious that Noah, we're told the first thing that Noah does of notability is that he builds an altar to the Lord uh, after they come out of the ark. And that's strange for a number of reasons. I guess, firstly, because God doesn't tell him to do that. There's kind of an instinctual, there's something that prompted Noah to do that. Yeah, could you guys talk about a little bit of the distinction of why that altar plays a significant role? Why are we being told an altar? I mean, was it just because Noah wanted to say thanks, God? How did he even know to do that? Right? Where does Noah get this idea from?
Well, Norm, you can jump in on this, but I just wanted to mention just the literary structure that's pretty important here. I guess a couple weeks ago we talked about how this whole story of Noah is structured, and the way that the Bible's written sometimes the stories are bookended with parallel corresponding parts. So the story begins with Noah building the ark, and it now is wrapping up. So this is a sign that the story is kind of wrapping up. He's building an altar. So it begins with building an ark, and now he's ending with building an altar. And there's something significant about why the altar is the conclusion. And I don't know if, Norm, you want to jump in there. I just wanted to make that literary point.
Yeah, I think it's really important to see that Noah builds this altar. We've alluded several times in the last episodes, they called episodes, where we parallel this entire story of Noah building the ark, coming out of it. You hear the echoes of be fruitful and multiply. All of this is mirroring Genesis 1. And how Genesis 1 ends with God resting. For the ancient Near East, a deity, God resting would be him taking his place in a temple. So in Genesis 1, we see that all of the earth is his temple. In contrast to other gods from other peoples would be like, oh, their temple is this building. But for the God of the Bible, all of creation is a temple. And it's important that after Noah leaves, after all the work is done, just like in the 6 days of creation for Genesis 1, when all the work is done, the flood, the rebuilding happens. We saw that at the mirror half at the beginning of chapter 8. It ends with rest, where Noah celebrates. He gives praise to God. He worships God. It ends in worship, which is rest for us. He ends in worship. And I guess that's very important because Noah didn't exit the ark and go crazy. Like, oh, I'm free. Yay. I've been in this prison for like a year and a half. This ark. No, I'm free. I can do whatever I want. There's an olive shoot. I'm going to have some like olive oil. I don't know, but like he didn't run around. Very first thing that Scripture tells us he does is that he built this altar to God. If anything, I would say when he builds an altar to God, it mirrors the top of chapter 8, where it says, "And God remembered Noah." When Noah came out of the ark, he didn't forget the one who saved him. He didn't just enjoy the gifts of God. He celebrated the giver of those gifts. You could almost read verse 20 as, "And Noah remembered the Lord."
Hmm.
So yeah, that's helpful to see that. Yeah, he's worshiping. That's kind of a close to this. Like Sabbath is always the end goal of all the striving, all of our striving. Uh, but why? I wonder why he built an altar, though. I mean, um, he has a barbecue of sorts with these different birds, and God's pleased with that aroma. I mean, uh, what do you guys think about picking up how when Adam and Eve had to leave the garden, God also killed an animal and covered them. In some sense, that's the first animal sacrifice to cover people kind of going out in an act. And I wonder how much of that is being picked up with Noah now coming out of the ark, and they're having how much of that is playing because the altar is usually associated. Yeah, it could be just praise, but there's also the sense of if something has to be sacrificed, there's almost a sense of something has been wrong. Um, yeah, so Noah maybe is picking up on this pattern from even Genesis, was it 3 or 4, where God takes those animals and covers Adam and Eve as they flee the garden. I wonder, what does this say about Noah? The fact that not only does he worship, but the way of worship is one of recognizing there's a sacrifice.
Yeah, this makes me think. I don't know how many people remember this, but in my last sermon, I mentioned this thing from New York Times. This guy talking about how he forgives New York. So he's just like going around every detail of regular life in New York. He forgives, and forgiveness seems to be a really big part of bringing things back, kind of like restoration. And in my mind, my own spiritual rest, and I think human spiritual rest, doesn't really happen until there's a sense of like, okay, I'm good with God. I'm good with, my life is sort of restored and forgiven from the past. And I don't know, the what you said, Rob, about sacrifice. That's a language of atonement. I mean, that comes in more detail later in the Bible, but this idea of atonement, as sacrifice is given to reconcile between God and man, or to cover shame. That I don't know. That I think that's really important for this idea of rest in the soul. That you're forgiven, that you're atoned for. It's an essential part in my mind.
Yeah, in some ways, it's reminding us there's never been a situation where there's a broken relationship where atonement, someone has to take the price to recover that, right? And it's very starkly aware for Noah and his family that things are not right between the earth and God, the world and God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if in some ways like it was just like common sense for him to be like, man, there's got to be some type of form of sacrifice as soon as I get out of here. Like the first thing we need to do is something needs to be offered up. These birds aren't gonna make do, but the least we can do is just try to there needs to be some type of amends between God and us, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine Noah in the ark with the storm going on outside, and I mean, I don't know if he could see out that window that he opens in the middle of chapter 8, but maybe he would peek out and see just utter destruction. To see the wrath of God just laid out. I wonder if it made him think. Like he realizes he is now the lone representative of humanity, and he must have at least had some moments of self-reflection as he was in the ark for a whole year plus, like a year and a half, right? He must have been thinking, this could have been on me.
Mhm.
And maybe coming out of the ark, I mean, in part to celebrate, because it's a fragrant burnt offering. I know we don't get those offering distinctions yet, but even like he implicitly knows that there must have been something wrong with
Mhm.
himself. I'm sure locked in an ark, there must have been some conflicts, maybe him and his wife, with his kids or something. He would recognize the brokenness even amongst himself. I mean, God says it in verse 21, right? The man's heart is evil from youth. And it might have just affirmed what no one knew about himself.
Mhm.
So yeah, a praise, but also a covering that he could even approach God.
Mhm.
Hmm. Yeah. And that at some level connects with God, right? Um, and then God blesses them, right? I'm kind of moving on to verse 9. God makes an initial promise to them, I guess, at the end of 8, right? I'll never again, do this. Um, but then in 9, he kind of comes close to Noah and his family and tells them what they need to do now. And we're getting that, it's very thick in Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply, fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, right? Like fill the earth with, let it flourish with human goodness and also just creational goodness, right? Um, and you get that twice there in verse 9:1 and then 9:7, right? So kind of what you're saying before, Josh, it bookends this little blessing that he gives them. This command, here's the plans for you guys, as you guys move back out into the earth. Um, yeah, we're talking these days about different stages of coming back into society now as COVID is lifting, and you know, we'd like explicit kind of detailed plans. And so God is kind of doing that for them here, right? He's giving them explicit plans of what you need to do. This is the game plan now, guys. Fill the earth and multiply. Um, yeah, I mean, anything that you guys see in that blessing that he gives them, that, um, yeah.
I think it talks about um, at least the echoes of have rule over creation. And as much as that is like bestowing power upon this representative of man, but also you have to remember representative of God, because he's the only one left in the image of God. Well, his family too, but he is like a vice regent, I don't know, of the earth. So as much as he has power, he also has this great responsibility as he goes back into all the earth. He can't just take advantage of creation as the beginning of chapter 6 the giants did, the great men did. He has to go back with um, like proper rule. I don't know what the right word would, proper rule, temperance, like kingly status. It says in verse 2 of chapter 9, like all of creation will fear you, or at least like revere you. So take care of it right. It's kind of the implied thing, I think. Just as when God tells Adam, have dominion, rule well, help it flourish. Now he has to go back, not to take advantage of everything, for us, I guess, not to go to every single restaurant and indulge on all the food that we missed, and all the parks and hug everyone. Well, don't do that, but don't go nuts. You go back with order to help creation grow again, to multiply, to flourish.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's a weighty call there. I think that there's a word for us there as he's going back.
Yeah, I like what you said about the creation in some sense being a temple. I think that's what you said earlier. And in my mind, that makes Noah in this passage kind of like a priest, and same thing with Adam in the garden, a priest. And in verse 2 it says, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast. That's language often that's used to talk about God, like the fear of God. And so it's almost like he's going out as a real representation, kind of like an image, like a priestly representative of God going out. And yeah, that brings even more of a weight into the calling, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I almost think it's implicit. It's also you. What do you guys think about it being explicit? Verse 4, right? Not we know that when God gives or there are commandments in the Bible, there's an implicit sense of going beyond just it. There's the heart of the commandment, like you shall not kill. Well, it also means you should cherish life, right? It goes beyond just the literal commandment. So it says, yeah, take I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to give you all the birds and all the fish. This is the earth is for you. But verse 4 starts with the but there are restrictions. You don't be greedy with the flesh is the sense I get in verse 4. You need to take your time and kind of cultivate it. Like don't be lustful with your desires with the earth. Um, like that's the kind of sense of you're eating your food before you even cook it kind of thing, like letting the passions of your flesh just overtake you. And then it kind of goes not just from beasts, but also from your relationships with other people. Don't let your greed and your desire, your flesh just kind of overwhelm you so you end up killing someone. Make sure you live in peace with both creation and your fellow neighbor. Um, and so what is the kind of picture that you see God resetting? Because it's very similar to, like we've been saying, to what God told Adam. Um, what has been God's big game plan for humanity since the beginning? If you like it in the shortest, most concise way, what do you guys see God kind of the Bible saying this is really what God is about for the earth? Like at the end of the day, this is from Old Testament to New Testament. What's kind of the picture that really being told here in so many words?
I mean, the way I would put it is he's interested in human flourishing, but in obedience. So like human flourishing through honoring God. And this goes back to the first episode that we had, talking about how really it's God putting in place laws and rules, not just arbitrarily, but for people to find true freedom within obedience. Kind of like it's if you're going outside, his commands, it's you're the one who's bringing the consequences upon yourself. And so God is not like arbitrarily saying, all right, so now I've freed you from the flood, now you got to listen to me again. It's no, I want you to flourish, but you can only do that through honoring me, honoring your neighbor. So I think it's kind of like that, like flourishing through honoring, through obedience, I would say.
We definitely see the importance of that nowadays, right? Flaunting our freedom at the cost of possibly endangering each other.
Right.
In order for us to be free, to really enjoy our freedom, requires us to obey a lot of restrictions, right? And that's always been the view of the Bible's understanding of definition of freedom, that it's a defined freedom, and that if we go over the boundaries of that, it just can bring death into where there should be life. I don't know if you had any other thoughts, Norm, before we move to the next section that
No,
you
I
wanted to
would I would just make that even more explicit, that for freedom, like all of this, as Josh was saying, it ends in worship. Like even caring for creation is an act of worship, caring for one another, caring for humans, all of it, helping it flourish, helping the world flourish is an act of worship. So I know like Noah could come out and have freedom, but I mean, I guess I'm going back to when he built an altar. Freedom for him did not, it necessarily included worship. We cannot have true freedom without worship.
Yeah, I think when we get to the end, sadly, Noah's story, the last narrative part that we give, that's not the next part, but when the end, we see what happens when we use our freedom kind of in ways that don't bring flourishing.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting how we see both sides of that coin. Um, but before we get that, then we kind of get God going, like giving more assurances of his covenant, which is a little, I mean, we've been talking about why the Bible sometimes is intentionally like it's being structured to be not redundant, but the repetition. But this seems more than just a repetition. Like God is really kind of going deep into this covenant thing. And I guess I wanted to ask you guys what you thought about that, because um, I don't know, as a kid, sometimes this passage was, that's why we have rainbows now. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, but it's, God is using the sign in the clouds, this bow in the clouds, but he's really, all of this is to really assure Noah of this covenant, his promise that he's making them. And I guess my question is like, why does God need to go at great lengths to really assure them of that? Um, he's just given them a really clear mission, provision, and instructions on how to carry it out well. But why? So where does the covenant kind of come into play with that?
I think like when it comes to the covenant, covenant is one of those really loaded words for us. It's the deepest. I think in our pre-discussion we called it the stickiest substance in the world. Like a covenant would bind God to his people in a bond that could never be broken. And if you, I guess maybe this, if I'm just kind of like zooming out, there's a Bible here. Sorry, I'm zooming out. Um, like every single block here gets a little bit bigger with more detail until you get to this last bit of the story where the covenant kind of fills in. It's not just that he's not going to destroy the earth and that it'll endure forever. It's not just that it's going to be full of life. There's all of that. He's not going to destroy it. It's going to be full of life because you're going to fill it and multiply, but it's going to be sustained because I've made a covenant, and a covenant is everlasting. Like it is as permanent as God is permanent. And I think it's a really powerful statement that, like, in the previous chapters, it did allude to a covenant that God was going to make, but it's really spelled out here, where God says, I'm gonna establish a covenant with you and your offspring that all of this stuff will happen. Like, and you see the repeat that the flood will never come. The beasts, all the animals will flourish because I've put you there. And I kind of get the sense that Noah can't believe it. Noah can't believe what a good promise this is. Like, how did all this happen to me? I just gave you a sacrifice because I thought I wasn't good enough, right? At least I'm putting these two things together now. And I was reading some narrative commentary about biblical narrative, how verse 12, like it says, and God said to start. But for biblical narrative, and this is kind of just like understanding how the Hebrew Bible is written, for verse 12, the fact that Noah doesn't respond or do anything, it's not like, oh, and he did everything the Lord told him to or anything like that. Noah doesn't say a single word. In biblical narrative, that silence has meaning. Noah's silence means that he couldn't, it usually means that he couldn't believe, or he needed more assurance. He needed more assurance. And then so verse 12 continues, and God said, this will be a sign. Every time you see this sign, you can be sure that I've made this promise with you. And it's really beautiful. That God would give us a sign because our faith isn't good enough, or our faith is lacking. He reaches down to show us, as often as it rains, we'll see God's promise to be true. I'll step back for a bit. But
it kind of reminds me of what you're saying is like how a parent might, if they have to step away from to go on a business trip and their kid's gonna miss them, and it says, well, I'm gonna take a picture of you and mommy, and every time I go to bed, I'm gonna look at it and I'm gonna be thinking about you guys. And you know, as the parent, you don't need that. You're gonna be thinking about your kids nonstop. But why are you telling that to the kid? That you have a sign for yourself. It's to actually assure them that you're thinking of them. And it's like so they can go to bed at night knowing daddy or mom, mommy's thinking about me. And
Hmm.
and that's kind of yeah, I never thought about it that way, but that's really amazing and really beautiful if you think about that.
It
Like
is.
God doesn't need a rainbow to remember his covenant. It's not like he's gonna forget. Why is he telling that to Noah? It's actually so that when Noah sees it or when humanity sees it, they're reminded, wow, God's thinking of us.
Hmm.
He's cares about humanity.
Yeah. No, that is beautiful. I mean, I would even go back to the ark itself being like God saying the idea of remembering we talked about last time is that's covenantal language. God saying, here's an ark, build it exactly like this. I want you to build it like it looks like the earth, like the Garden of Eden almost. Like I remember that there was something better. Oh, I want you to, look up in the sky. I remember. So it's like yeah, it's like just like an overwhelming reminder that God is not forgetting uh his people. I mean, it's exactly what you guys said, but yeah, that is very moving.
Uh, it does seem pretty random that God uses a rainbow of all things. Well, I guess it makes sense because he just destroyed so much of the world with rain clouds. But now it becomes the redeeming sign. The symbol of death, you might say, uh, now becomes the symbol of covenant. And we shouldn't be searching very hard in our Bibles to try to figure out where would we see that again, because the cross, if anything, is a symbol of death that now when we look at it, you know, why maybe people back then had like little put little rainbows on their car rear view mirrors. I don't know. But like
Hmm.
back then, like that became this what became a terrible sign, rain clouds. You think about how traumatic that sign might have been, but God redeems that for humanity and says, no, this is going to be the sign of life and promise coming from that. That's incredible.
But
But
I think there's a little bit more than that. No, I think we looked into earlier, like that it actually doesn't say rainbow.
yeah, that's where I was going. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think because we were kind of curious, I know in all our children's stories, and if you grew up reading this, you always thought rainbow, but the word there for bow is actually the same word that they usually use for like a hunting bow. It's a weapon of war. Um, and the first time I heard someone use that imagery, or at least switch the imagery, I was like, oh, okay, that's creative. But when we actually look at the text, the word used is not rainbow. It is literally the bow, and the way that it's used throughout Old Testament is like a bow and arrow. So he does not just take the weapons of the clouds and turn and rain and turn it into something beautiful. He turns
Hmm.
the weapons that humans use to kill each other, a language that we understand, and turned it into a symbol of peace, a symbol
Yeah,
of the covenant.
and
So,
he hangs it up. He hangs up the weapon, kind of.
yeah, some commentators have talked about how this arrow points upwards.
Not at humanity, not at the earth.
Yeah,
It points, it's on pain of if this promise is broken, that the bow's aimed at God,
yeah,
which is similar to how the other covenants go, right? With Abraham, God like walks between the the sacrificed animals there, saying, "If I break this promise, the same will be done to me."
hmm
So, yeah, we're given this kind of redemptive symbol of of death and brokenness in the world, and it becomes the promise of life and God's favor between peace on earth, right, and goodwill towards men, you might say, right? Um, And that is that would be wonderful if it was ended there, and God and humanity lived in peace together and they flourished. But what's so strange, and what is so really incredible about so many of this Bible stories, very candid about the brokenness in we get this really interesting twist in the latter parts of Noah's life. So he becomes this man of the soil, and he plants a vineyard, which that's fine. But yeah, this is what God kind of told him to do. But then he kind of has too much of the wine, becomes drunk. Um, yeah, I just wanted to know what you guys thought about why it might be taking us here. So there's obviously this very awkward scene between exposure at the very least. It might be implying something even deeper, and really, um, yeah, some type of brokenness really happened between Ham and uh, Noah. It's interesting for us to note that it came from Noah kind of going too far with what the fruit of the land, right? He planted a vineyard, and all things in moderation are good, but kind of like what we were just saying, but we're not called to abuse creation. And you kind of get very early hints of, once again, humanity goes back to taking too much, uh, like consuming too much. And the moment that humans aren't created to just be consumers of the earth, right? And just use it for, and so he kind of has too much. He becomes drunk. And it leads to this familial brokenness. And yeah, so what do you guys kind of see here? This is kind of like very stark imagery. It's almost like someone completely different is writing this part of the story, because it gets really personal really fast, right? You're taken
Yeah.
into this bedroom scene with Noah.
Yeah, I guess we can go get into that in detail, but just to give a bigger picture perspective, someone might say like, "Oh man, like it looks like the flood, this whole thing didn't work because, God made this whole effort to clean out the earth, so to say, and somehow everything went back to brokenness." But I think it's important to see two um, two reasons why this story is important. Number one is the story of Noah. It's important to know that that's not the end. It happened in history, but also points forward to a bigger reality. So, what is the story of Noah? The old world is passing away, and a new world is being ushered in. Right. So that's a sign that's pointing forward to something that will happen, and we can talk about that. Namely, when Jesus comes, an old world will pass away, and a new heavens and new earth will come. So the story of Noah is actually pointing to something that will happen in the future. So that's actually not the end, right? The other thing we have to know is that the story of Noah after the flood, God is preparing his people to live amongst brokenness. Like God assumes brokenness. He doesn't say, "Oh, okay, that didn't work, so I guess I have to, conjure up something else." God already, when we see him tell Noah to bring in the clean and unclean animals, God's making a separation between what is clean and what is unclean. So he's already assuming that the world's going to go awry again, but the purpose is that he's now making a very clear separation. Noah and his family, they're going to be holy. There's going to be a holy remnant of people living amongst brokenness. So that clear delineation is made after the flood. So I don't know if that's helpful, but there are clear reasons why the story of Noah is there. It's not that God kind of like tried something and it didn't work. I mean, I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, I think that gives us a big like whole Bible view of how this
Yeah.
story fits. But even in the small bit in just chapter 9, well, the whole thing that we read today, if we're gonna see that God says to them, "Your heart is evil, but I'm still making this promise that I'm not going to destroy." we immediately after the covenant is given, we see a mixed bag of obedience. Yes, I want to make a vineyard, right? But also indulgence. Like the sin is still there. Sin hasn't I think we could comfortably say for the writers of scripture here, the promise that was made in Genesis 3 has not been fulfilled yet, not in full anyway.
Can you explain what promise you're referring to?
So when sin entered in, God makes this promise that sin is going to bruise. I forget what I get mixed up on all translations. Bruise or heal, but you will crush his head. The head of sin will be destroyed, and that hasn't happened in full. Like this story tells us that hasn't happened in full. But so quickly after the covenant that was made, I think it also points us to consider how we will live, because it gives us these tropes, I don't know if that's fair, like of those that honored Noah rightly, that being Shem and Japheth, and those that took advantage and shamed or defiled or whatever it might be. And there are real blessings and curses associated with that kind of living. So the world has been renewed, but the evidence that it's not fully renewed is there. And the question for us as we end this story of Noah is, are we going to orient our lives and live into the newness that God has set up when order is preserved, right? Be fruitful and multiply, make the earth run. Or are you going to go back to what I wanted to destroy? And that's kind of the question for us as we live. Like, do we want to fear God as Noah did, even though he, kind of enjoyed a little too much? Or are we going to take advantage of one another? Shame those around us by, hey, look at him. At least that's how I read. At the very least, right? Ham is saying, hey, brothers, look at our father, the righteous one of God. Look at him.
Yeah. I think in our preparation, Norm, you brought up a good point of how that's very much the nakedness of Adam and Eve, that the fundamental problem with humanity is that we're uncovered, that we're undone. Mm-hmm. And the work of God is to cover and bring dignity. And he just kind of, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging. Like the Bible's full of just like the scoffer, like the one who makes fun of humanity. And yet the one who's doing God's work is bringing dignity back into humanity. And
covering. Mm-hmm. Yeah, making peace and gets the blessing. So for all of our nakedness, our sin, like this is where I would like jump to where Josh was going about Christ. All of our brokenness, all of our sin, all the ways that we have gotten drunk and lay naked in our tent. Christ has been the right brother to us in Shem and Japheth, in covering us and making us presentable. And thus we can praise him. We can say he is the one who has become our salvation, as the psalmist would say. He has covered all my brokenness, my nakedness, and given me, I'm mixing so many images from the Bible right now, and given me robes of white. I don't know. Like there's just so much here where we can see Christ making us beautiful, making us lovable before the Father. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this makes me think about, this makes it so clear after reading this story like this of what baptism is about in many ways, that there's a water baptism that can't cut away sin. What you were saying, Josh, sin still remains after water comes on you. And even if it were to drown out all humanity except for the best of us and restart again, there'd still be sin in the world. And so like a better baptism has to come. And I think that's why Christians will always be associated with baptism, that there's been this washing of what Christ has done in his blood. He's the perfect sacrifice on the altar of God, and has cleansed us and truly washed away all sin in us. Not that we don't sin, but that it's covered by his blood.
Mm.
Um, mm. Yeah. One takeaway from each of us is we kind of, I mean, man, and as we're doing this, why don't, if you guys have questions, we've consistently looked forward to Andrew Ewan's great questions. But we'd love for any of you to ask any questions as we're kind of wrapping up Noah's story. And I think we were also curious. We also wanted to field questions. Would it be helpful to transition this to Facebook rather than YouTube? Is that easier for you guys to watch? And also, we want to know what kind of passages you might be interested in us going through next.
Or if not passages, what topics, and then we could probably try to find a passage that would get around that.
Yeah, just throw out some suggestions. But yeah, while you guys think about that, any questions in general, would you prefer Facebook over YouTube? And are there any particular topics or passages or texts that you guys would love to have us go through with you in? And but yeah, for the three of us, what's one takeaway that you guys have as we kind of close?
Yeah, I like what Norm said earlier about the covenant really being initiated and sustained by God, just like God really sticking to us and not us to him. And, if anyone is feeling today like, man, Jesus really went through all that, and it's almost like Noah looking, people reading the story of Noah is like, oh man, God went through all of that, the flood and everything, and people still messed up, and sometimes we feel like that, like, man, I still messed up, even though I got baptized and he saved me. Just know that it's God's covenant holding you, not your consistency. So, he still has you, and he still, that stickiness is still as strong as ever. That's what we would say. I guess that's my takeaway.
I think my probably biggest thing for now, at least in this moment in history, is that freedom ends in worship. I honestly can't wait to go out, and I hope my favorite restaurant, my Indian restaurant a few blocks away, is still open when I get back. Things like that. I mean, but freedom is not about indulging as like Noah did and kind of got caught in some weird situation, but it's about worship and honoring God, and that worship extends to caring for one another, covering one another's faults. So as we go out, there's going to be a lot of hurting people. You may be among them. I'm sure I am among them. We need to care for one another as God has called us to care for one another. That is a big part of worship.
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of, how to, one of the things that sticks out with the people's mission, Noah's family's mission, was to just create a society that really cared about the small details, from the animals to people being treated with dignity. And that's so easy to turn backwards, right? To spill blood over, we use that phrase, and yet we do that so easily. And so how am I gonna participate in a society as a child of God that really wants to see people flourish physically and spiritually? Yeah. So I mean, that's it for us, I think. But I mean, we're really thankful to have gone through with you guys. We learned a lot from this, so it's not like, we did this for you, but I think this is just as much for us three. Yeah, we'd even if they're,
This
they're
is fun for us. This
very much
happened.
so.
This happened in our pastoral staff meetings before it became a live stream, like weekly almost, right?
Like, why are we not sharing this with other people? Yeah.